y'all doing?
I'm gonna do Shazam.
No, I didn't. I meant like right now.
Oh, talking to you.
Talking to me? Well, that's funny because I'm talking to you.
Hanging out. That's what we're doing.
This has been weird not recording in the morning.
Yeah, it changes it for sure.
Like talking to you guys without coffee in my hand is strangeness.
Yeah.
So, well, hey everybody, how y'all doing out there? This is another episode of the Southern Fried Geekery podcast. As always, I am Caleb Alexander McKenzie.
Matt Trogdon. And I'm Craig Lance.
You are Craig Lance, the one and only Craig Lance. You are, in fact, my favorite Craig Lance of all the Craig Lances.
That's awesome.
I think you're my favorite Craig, actually. Like, period. Just across the board.
Well, that's nice. I don't know how many Craigs you know, but
I know several.
Still pretty nice. Do you?
I do. I know several.
There you go.
None of them.
You may have some apologizing to do if they hear the show.
I mean, I'll pay somebody off. So that's how it'll work. So I don't know about you guys, but I am really, really excited for this episode. For one reason, it came with not a lot of homework, which was fun because I'm in this weird place in life where I don't want to do homework right now. But for another reason,
not a weird place.
But for another reason is because we get to finally. And this is, searching as always for silver linings right now. We finally get to have a conversation with a really good friend of ours together. Like, we've had conversations with him separately, but we now all get to do it as kind of a cohesive unit. And that person is none other than Mr. Justin Jordan. I'm super excited about this. So without kind of any further ado, let's get into talking to Justin.
Yeah, next week I'm going to... so I've only got work scheduled for 4 days of the week.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to attempt to take Wednesday off. Because what I have found in practice since the world started to end is that I am really only getting 4 days anyhow. So I've decided to lean into it and try to plan to only do 4 days. We will see if that actually works, or if I just end up working like 3 days and I'm just screwing myself. So we'll see.
So what I try to do is I work 3 full days. Wednesday I work a half a day because comic book day, and Friday I work a half a day because Friday.
Oh yeah. It's just like last week in particular, like despite the social distancing kind of thing, I had people coming and going from the house almost every day, or I was going somewhere to do stuff. So even though we were like not getting within 15 feet of each other, and it was disrupting the day, which is not inherently a bad thing. It is nice to actually see other humans once in a while, but it was just one of those deals where I'm like, man, this is just jacking up my schedule. But I have found in general that I seem to be right now only good for like 4 days a week of like actual like consistent like head down, nose to the grindstone kind of work. So we'll see if I can plan that, or if it's just going to be one of those things where planning to take an extra day just means I get 2 or 3 days of actual work. The upside, such as it is that I am sufficiently ahead on pretty much anything that I've got going on that it doesn't super matter. I work pretty fast when I am actually, getting my day's work in, so I'm still, I'm fine. But I also am one of those people that like I set more or less arbitrary like deadline goals for myself, and then like get really upset if I don't hit them. So you know.
I am 100% that person. But I mean, you have to set those goals, right? Like, it's especially when you're pretty much in charge of your own flow. What you get done, what you get accomplished, and how quick you do it. And you've got a looming deadline somewhere. I think you have to set those arbitrary goals just for yourself to keep yourself on point.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's one of those things where I don't feel like you're going to be able to make like a freelance career work if you don't have some level of that that impetus. So
yeah, I mean, I'm a procrastinator by nature, but like I've always told my children, is if you're going to procrastinate, you have to be really good at handling pressure. Because if you wait to the last minute to do everything, you're always going to be stressed. So
That is 1000% true, and that is the sort of thing that I will sort of I can end up defaulting to. I've gotten out of the habit over the years, but certainly, and especially when I was in school back in the day, it was one of those things where like I would be immensely productive under pressure, but then it would burn me out that I was useless till the next time, which like is not a good cycle to be on. It's especially not as like as a middle-aged working professional these days. So I'm like, yeah, well,
Yeah.
I try to be good about. That's what people talk about, like, oh, pulling all-nighters and stuff. I'm like, man, I can do that, and I very occasionally have to do that just because of demands. But like, that kind of stuff just jacks me up for so long, like in terms of like sleep schedule and like productivity and all that kind of stuff, that I try to keep to a relatively kind of sane, manageable sort of thing. But even then, I get a certain amount of like, I always want to do more than I really have the ability to do. So there's a certain amount of like project creep.
Oh, right.
You know, so it's like tomorrow, like I'm going to attempt to work on like, I got to do a document for a new comic. I got to do urban animal script, the first thing. I got to do some extra work on another script, but I'm also trying to do like 6 pages of like a spec script, and like, you know, it all kind of adds up. And if I can do that schedule and I can do it fairly consistently for a while, but it's also one of those things where like I am aware that I am working like right at that fine edge where if I add like one more thing in, I'm going to burn out. Like,
Right.
it's that you're at a marathon pace, but you want to go like 5% more than the marathon pace, and like turns out you can't run marathons when you do that.
No, not when you're sprinting half the way.
Yeah.
So the tricky thing with that is you can't put creativity on a clock. I know back when I was doing a lot of writing, it was, you can't really make that happen, but you have to put yourself in a cycle where your brain's like kind of gets in a pattern of kickstarting itself at a certain time. And a lot of my friends, yourself included, who are writers, they can make the schedule work for them to a certain point. It's one of those things that like you have to condition yourself. It's
You
almost like
absolutely do.
it's trying to lasso something that's intangible.
It is, and it's one of those things where I have found that you can definitely get yourself into a rhythm of being like, okay, today from like 12 to 4, which is usually like working chunk of the day. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do these things, and you can do it. And sometimes you have to force it, and sometimes it flows. And excuse me, you can do that pretty easily. Well, I say easily, comparatively easily. Like, but what will also sometimes throw me off is that like every once in a while you have a bunch of projects to work on, but you get into the flow on like one particular project and you don't want to stop because like, you're in the flow. So there's that kind of like management of like, all right, I'm going to spend, it turns out I'm going to spend 3 hours doing this one thing. Well, that's the other stuff needs to get kicked to another day. So how do you kind of manage that? Which for me is actually, it's not a huge problem, but it happens often enough that it is something that I have to try to like account for.
I was going to say that sounds like every day that ends in Y for me. This is what I'm going to get done, and 3/4 of it gets done and move to the next day.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, and I can imagine, so for a writer like you who shifts gears with you are not limited in what you write. Sometimes it'll be horror stuff. You've got a team book going on. Sometimes it's superhero stuff. So I can just imagine it's hard to, again, I use the analogy of shifting gears. It's got to be a little bit difficult to shift from one to the other. It's, there's not a button you can push when you're flowing one way and then you need to jump to another idea or another plot with a completely different style of characterization. It's got to be a difficult transition.
Yeah, it often is. I mean, it's just one of those. Like the other stuff, it's always kind of a matter of like, I want to say managing compromises, but that's probably not the right phrase for it. It is, on one hand, that is absolutely true. On the other hand, what is also true is that like if I intentionally am only working on one thing, that also does not work super well for me. Like I'm kind of obligated to work on multiple things, but that also has like the downside of the gear shifting aspect of it, like can be a thing and often is. So it's a matter of like, I kind of mused the other week that like one good way to make yourself insane, and I will say this from personal experience, is I simultaneously want to work more and less. Like
Absolutely.
it's one of those things where like I wish I was working on less projects, but like when given the opportunity, I absolutely never do so. Like if space becomes available, I just fill it with other stuff. So I have these two conflicting urges that I have never been great at reconciling, and am still not 10 odd years in.
Well, and that's part of the freelance thing, right? Because you're always, well, when this work dries up, what's next? So if you don't have the next 2 or 3 things in the bucket already, in the pipeline, you're panicking.
Yeah.
That's my take on it, anyways, from my side of it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I definitely have these dreams of, I am in a very privileged position as it is. I right now have, between my low cost of living and my cash reserves, because my income flow is not steady, and the work that I have contracted, like I should be fine for the next 24 months, generally. But I also would love to be to this point where I'm like, oh, I've got, $1 million invested, which means I can, I don't have to always be doing that sort of thing. But I also am aware that that in practice, it would almost certainly not change my behavior. So it is kind of like a pipe dream. Yeah, I don't know. Once you get into that sort of freelance mindset of always having to be hustling for the next thing, I don't think it is easy to break out of it, even if you rationally can. I don't think it's easy to like slow down. It's like people will sort of, I've heard, kind of wonder about like why does Bruce Willis, who as far as we know has not gone and hawked to the IRS or gambled away all his money, why does he do 1,000 crappy movies a year? And he does. It's not like the Nick Cage thing, right, where we know why Nick Cage is doing it, but like Bruce Willis, as far as we know, is fine, and I actually think it's that. I think it's a combination of like, I think he probably likes what he does, but I think it's also when you get into that hustle mode, even when you reasonably like don't need to hustle by any rational standard, you look at your bills coming in, you're like, I gotta be doing stuff. They're gonna forget I exist. Something's gonna happen. I'm gonna run out of money.
Don't know what to do with my hands.
Yeah.
Wow, Justin, you came in hot, dude. You came in ready to roll, and I did get most of that recorded because I was quick with the button. But just for those of you who are listening to the podcast, who are trying to catch up, we are extremely fortunate, happy, and I'd say blessed to be finally getting to chat with our good friend, Mr. Justin Jordan. And I think you can hear how he's doing. He's doing all right. Obviously, are things going well for you up there, man?
Yeah, reasonably so. I from an outside perspective, yes, things are going okay. It is one of those advantages of being a freelancer as well, especially the kind of freelancer that I am, is that the whole coronavirus COVID situation has not super radically affected my day-to-day life. I just yeah, it really hasn't. I go to the grocery store and I go a little further, a lot further than I used to, and get them to put it in the trunk of my car. And other than that, the day-to-day hasn't changed. But I was having a thing like 2 weeks ago where I just got into kind of a dark place. Probably sounds melodramatic for it, but like I am prone to bouts of depression anyway, and have been for like 20 years. So that's nothing new, and it's manageable, right? Like ever since I realized what was going on back in college, and was able to get on medication and do that kind of stuff, I've adapted pretty well. It just, there are periods where I get into a down cycle, and the notable effect for me is that makes everything 1,000% harder. You know, I can still power through. I can still do my work, and I can still do all that. And I had one of those, and just combined with other stuff. But it was, you know, it was like 2 weeks where I was just on the struggle bus.
Yeah, I mean, it's like running with 40 extra pounds in your backpack. You can do it. It's just, you know it's there. You always know it's there.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us are going through that right now. I think it's just kind of a, you know, there's a collective energy in the world that kind of leads people who, you know, kind of the same boat you're in, people who are susceptible to that, just kind of naturally flows there. So, but I mean, I am glad that you're in a good place. It's interesting to me that you say your day to day hasn't changed. We were talking to our buddy Jeremy Hahn, who's also a freelancer, a couple weeks ago, and he was kind of telling us how he didn't expect his day to day to change, but in fact it had. Like everything was kind of different. He was finding it hard to really keep himself in the workflow, and he didn't necessarily understand why, because, you know, it's that same thing. It was, you know, I go to my office, I sit in front of my computer, I type out, you know, things, but it was harder for him to get in that flow. And I think what you're saying speaks to a little bit of that, and it's you know, how it affects people different ways.
Oh yeah, that is 1,000% true. Jeremy, though, has, in addition to that, he also has, you know, kids and that kind of stuff that I do I think probably make his life kind of manifestly different than mine. But yeah, I will say, while my day-to-day hasn't changed, my day-to-day has become more difficult. Like, right? Like, it really is. Like, and, you know, I'm saying that from the perspective of May, right? Like, so there's this whole recency bias, because I look at March, and March was essentially a lost month for me. Like, I got some work done, but I almost basically, you know, got maybe what I would do in a week done over the course of 4 weeks. And I realized at the time, like, I had gotten into like a bad habit of, like, I would turn on the news in the morning, like MSNBC or something, and just leave it on all day. And I was getting this full torrent of like coronavirus nightmare shit. And like, that was not good for my mental state. So that was different. Like, I was still doing the same stuff I did, and I didn't really stop doing the stuff that I did, but like the context was different, right? Like, it goes back to that. I think it's a Hitchcock quote, which might be apocryphal anyhow, even if it is Hitchcock. But it's like, if you're in a room and you're talking, you're having a conversation, and there's a closed door behind you, like, that's fine. But even if the conversation and everything is exactly the same, and you know on the other side of that door is a corpse, everything is different, just because the context has changed.
Right.
And this is very much like that in a lot of respects. Yeah. I have found that kind of acutely, though, things have changed. Like, so in a normal course, so the last time up until this week, I had not seen anybody that was not related to me that I know. So aside from, like, you know, strangers at the store and that kind of stuff, I hadn't seen any of my friends since February 11th till March 12th or May, rather. May. So that's also a time period where, in the normal circumstances, I would have for certain gone to Emerald City Comic Con, and I would have spent a week hanging out with the Temple Smiths. And I probably, I was scheduled to do like a week-long writer's room thing in person in LA. And none of that stuff happened. And like, I realized, and this goes back, you know, to that 2 week kind of dark stretch. And I don't know that it's causal so much as my having a down cycle made me think about it. But I also realized that, like, I had not seen my friend Nikki, who Caleb, you've both met, actually.
Yeah. I know Nikki. I sure do.
So I hadn't seen Nikki since February 11th, and that is the longest I have gone without seeing Nikki since I met her. So that just started to weigh on me. So it's like that acute stuff is different, and it's kind of grinding. And like, you know, over the course of this, you know, we had Easter and stuff. And my family's real close, and normally we would get together for Easter, for Mother's Day, and we're not really able to do that. So those acute things like kind of hit me. But like, you know, in an average day, like I would, you know, get up and go for a walk, and I do that on the rail trail, and I could still do that. And I would lift weights, and I do that in my exercise shed, so I could still do that. And I would, all that stuff has not changed. It's just, it becomes much more difficult. It's like trying to swim with a rock kind of thing, but like I'm still swimming as it goes.
Right. Now, are you able to give Tom Waite, and this is the most important question I'll ask you this entire podcast. Are you giving Tom Waits adequate attention and love?
Yes, and this is the best period in her entire life as far as she's concerned, because very famously, Tom does not like people coming to the house, and she doesn't like me leaving. So this is great for her.
That's amazing.
Now, for anybody who might not know, Tom Waits is Justin's ridiculously adorable cat.
She is,
and also, and it's funny you mentioned Nikki, because both Tom and Nikki play a really predominant role in a book you did. Was it 2 years ago now? Family Trait.
2 or 3. I am bad with time at that sense, but yeah.
We get it. We get it when it comes out. You're associated with it when you're writing it, which there could be a year or two difference in that.
Yeah. Me and Nikki co-wrote the Family Trade out from Image with the amazing Morgan Beam on art. She did watercolor art for it, and then Tom Waits features as a character in the book. So yeah, they were
amazing. I
love that book. I wish it had done better. But that's kind of the case for like 90% of comics. So.
with missing the cons and stuff, you're talking about not getting to see people and how that dark period kind of weighs and plays on aspects of your life you don't necessarily think it. It can't help that not only are you missing friends and human interaction at on the convention circuit and stuff like that. Are you like a lot of other freelancers where that's a significant portion of your annual income, or are you set up to where most of your work is what you do with your writing?
No, it does not. So I, as a writer, I'm actually pretty lucky again that in an average year I'll about break even on conventions. But it's a zero kind of thing. Like not going to them doesn't substantially change my income, just because normally I would maybe make as much as I was going to pay. So there's that. I will say there's a potential hard to quantify effect that like being at conventions and talking to editors and meeting new people and all that kind of stuff absolutely does make you money in the long run. Like I can honest to God pinpoint one particular New York Comic Con that has over the years for sure made me low 6 figures in income from having been there, right? That would probably not have happened if I hadn't gone. So it's hard to quantify like what the effect of that is. But yeah, artists and stuff tend to be much more kind of hit by that kind of stuff than writers do. Because honestly, all I've generally got to sell are my trades and occasionally like patches and pins and stuff. And I'm lucky that does well enough to usually kind of keep me in the black for a year, but it's not one of those deals where I go to a convention and I'm selling commissions and original art and I make like 10 grand, which I've seen friends do. So yeah.
Well, you usually, every time I've seen you at a convention, which I met you at New York Comic Con. Yes. And we kind of became friends ever since then. But you always seem to be tabling at least with or next to or very very near to one of your artists. So is that kind of do you kind of see that as like a tag team, a way that you can bring in the clientele to their table and like help each other?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay. And it is that, and it is also flat out that I just am friends with many of the artists I work with, and really like that. So like with Trad and I, it's actually been somewhat of a bummer because now Trad is associated with Felix Comic Book Art, which is great for Trad, but like we've both lamented that it makes it harder for us to table near each other just because Felix tends to buy blocks of tables and that kind of thing.
Oh, right.
And that's there's a business aspect to that, but flat out Trad and I are buddies, so like we like to hang out. So it's it's one of those kind of things. But yeah, it's one of those deals where if I have my preference, I like to have the artist nearby just so that if people are coming up and they're seeking me out in particular, I can send them to the artist in a way that's easier than them just being at the convention. Because it's one thing to be like, oh yeah, he's over at wherever, and when I'm at cons, and I'm there with artists I work with, I try to make sure I know where their tables are so I can send people to them. But it is
Yeah.
much easier when they're 2 feet away.
When you have when you have a co-pilot nearby to protect you.
Oh gosh, that is absolutely true.
So I mean, you mentioned Tradmore, who famously you have worked with on Luther Strode, and it's interesting to me because when you and Trad did that book, that was kind of Trad was on the scene, but he wasn't quote unquote Tradmore yet. Like he was still developing that persona. And I think the same could be said with a lot of the other artists that you work with. I mean, Rebecca Isaacs that you're doing Reaver with, Morgan Bean that you did Family Trade with, Dead Body Road. I don't know. Mateo Escalera was already Mateo Escalera at that point, but Ibrahim Mustafa that you did Savage Things with. You kind of have a history and a reputation for finding these artists who are, yeah, I think artists and people who are really tapped into the art game know who they are, but I would say that your average comic reader doesn't. Are you building those relationships at the conventions, or like how do you? And I guess I'm asking for a trade secret here. How do you find these people? Like how did you come across Tradmore, Kyle Stram, all of these people who had a name for themselves, but they weren't mainstream names. Like these are people who love the medium of comics more so than they love Batman or Superman or Captain America and the Avengers. How do you get these artists?
It's varied over the years, and it varies from time to time. So with Trad, basically, I had come up with the idea for The Strange Town of Luther Strode, which was with the book we broke in on. And I knew that I wanted someone with a Ryan Otley type energy. Now, bear in mind, this is still true, actually, because Ryan Otley's not like he's changed radically, but this was 2009. So that was, that's some context for when this was. And I was looking for somebody with Ryan Otley energy, and I was drifting around on DeviantArt, which at the time was a much more useful place to find comic book artists than I think it is these days.
Yeah.
Because I think people have just kind of moved to Instagram and that sort of thing. So it was funny. I was looking for an artist, but at the particular moment that I was looking, when I found Trad, I was actually just looking at 100 Bullets fan art, just because I like 100 Bullets. And Trad had done...
You're a man of good taste. That's why.
Yes, that is accurate. I was looking at so Trad went to the Savannah College of Art and Design, SCAD, which many of the artists I've worked with have gone to, which figures into the question you just asked me, but I'll get to that in a second. And so I was looking at this 100 Bullets fan art, and Trad had done for one of his classes there, he had drawn and inked an original 100 Bullets story. It was like 5 pages or whatever. I'm like, oh, that looks great. And I clicked back to his profile and I looked at his other art, and it had, obviously it's Tradmore art, right? So it's Tradmore. So there's that. Immediately, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, sweet. But he also, in addition to the obvious like stylistic kind of thing for it, he also had a lot of work up, which gave me this kind of instinct that he would actually be able to produce.
Yeah.
And looking at his stuff, we had the same. My judgment was that we had the same kind of sensibilities and stuff, and fairly crucially, like he also had contact information available, which there is an amazing number of artists who will have a website or a DeviantArt account or an Instagram thing. Less so with Instagram, because you do have the direct message kind of option, but have no means to contact them. Like, even though they explicitly want to work with people, I was like, dude, like,
yeah, how do I get in touch with you if you don't tell me how?
If your email is buried somewhere that I have to work hard for it, like, there's just, you're not usually going to be that special. Like, you know what I mean? And if it's not there at all, like, I'll at the time was willing to put work in, but there's, only so much work in. But Trad was
right.
Easy to contact. He was available. We got on well. And from a writery standpoint, because people ask me this sort of thing, it's kind of a tangent on there. But part of what went into Trad and I's relationship beginning was that it was not my first rodeo. I had been doing small press and anthology work and putting together pitches since like 2000 or so. So there was 8 or 9 years before I went to trad, and that factors in because by the time I approached trad, I had a fairly polished approach down, which was like, hey, I'm Justin Jordan. I really liked your stuff. I saw it here. Told him I saw it at DeviantArt. And I have this project I think you might be interested in. I gave like a 1-sentence what Luther Strode was about. If you're interested, just shoot me an email back. I can send you more stuff I've worked on, and I can give you more notes about that. I didn't attach anything. I didn't include links and that sort of thing because I wanted to make it as safe as possible for a stranger approaching somebody cold to do that. So he's like, yeah, send me your stuff. And I had, like 200 pages of various comics to like be able to be like, hey, I can do comics, and also I am committed. You know what I mean? I'm not a fly by night kind of thing. There's this body of work behind me that kind of demonstrates it. And that went a long way to like building that kind of trust, which I think for people that can't draw is still a fairly solid sort of way to, try to approach do things. I always advise writers who want to just write to work on stuff and always be working on new stuff and try to get stuff drawn, because it gives you both the practical experience of working with an artist, which is not to be underestimated, but also it gives you a body of work that shows those kind of things to an artist. I think that's important. So that was one way it happened. But then even to go with like Luther Strode, I actually had known Felipe from Felipe Sobrero, who is our colorist and has been a colorist on Spread as well, and Felipe and I have worked together a lot over the years. He's actually designed all the logos for my Mid Central books, for instance. So with Felipe, we had been involved in DC's Zuda contest in around the same time, which was back in 2007-ish. DC did a thing where they would pay you to do web comics and people would vote on it American Idol style.
Mm-hmm.
And if you did it, it got picked up, all that kind of stuff. That is sufficiently ancient history that I always feel the urge to recap it for people. And that is actually, that is where John Bivens and I, who did the latter half of Spread, we worked together on that. But like Felipe, where I actually met John and Felipe both was at Warren Ellis's The Engine, but we were also familiar from Zuda. So I approached him. So that's one way of doing it. Whereas with Kyle Strom, it was Tim Seeley introduced me to Kyle at New York Comic Con. I think it was the year that Strode came out. In fact, I'm sure it was the year Strode came out. So I met him at that con, and then we talked, and I liked what he did, and I had this idea for Spread, and so that happened. But it can happen a lot of different ways. I have worked with Ariella Cristantina, for instance, on Deep State over at Boom, and she is another Scadling, and I met her through trad. I met Morgan Beam through the Scad connection. I met Jorge Corona, who's Morgan's husband now. They were not married at the time, but I met him at the same time period, and we've pitched a bunch of stuff. We have not got it through, but he's gone on to do, Middle West and stuff with Scotty Young.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that kind of thing. Others, like I knew Ibrahim from having met him at a con. I actually met him at the last Stumptown. They actually closed it down after that out in Portland.
Yeah.
So, but that was, we were looking for an artist for it, and Jamie Rich, the editor, was the executive editor of Vertigo at the time. R.I.P. Vertigo, said to us, he was like, how about Ibrahim? I'm like, oh yeah, I knew of him, and I knew him a little bit, and so I worked that kind of way. So it can happen all kinds of different ways. It's not normally that I meet someone at a con and then like their work and approach them for a book. It's that has happened, and that's what happened with Kyle. What is more common is that I'm kind of familiar with their work and I get to know them at conventions, and it looks like, they become top of mind, and it looks like we would get along, which, that is one of the unspoken risks of doing a bunch of creator-owned books and stuff, especially if you're doing it through Image Central, where you are the entire thing, right? There's no editorial, there's no production, unless there's production in sense of like putting the book together, but there's not people there's no layers of insulation between you and the team, right? So if
Right.
you do a book somewhere else, there's editorial and all that kind of stuff. So if you do a book at Image Central, you are basically tied together for the life of that IP, unless you decide to, buy them out or some such thing. So if you make a bad decision, and I have, well, you're basically in a marriage with no chance of divorce kind of thing in that aspect. So
Yeah, that book just dead, or that
yep.
IP's just dead at that point.
Yep. And so it actually, there is a lot of value to meeting somebody at a convention just to know that you will get along. But it is rarely that I am wandering through the aisles of a con and I see somebody has really cool art and then I start, I approach them later and do that kind of thing. I don't think I've ever actually done that.
Have you noticed that the inverse has kind of become true as your name has kind of become, if you've built a larger platform for yourself? Do you have kind of new and burgeoning artists sending you their work? Is that
yes. Yes, and sometimes that works out. I don't discourage people from that. It's kind of a bummer because often they're not good enough, and then you're like, oh yeah, awesome, send me to this. You're just not there yet.
Right.
And the even more grim, and you probably won't ever be, which I don't ever tell people, but you do honestly sometimes think it.
Yeah.
Trad and I have discussed, we've never put our finger on what to call it beyond the X factor, but there are artists who, even if you're looking at, oftentimes if somebody is going to have the capability of being a professional at some point, you can even look at their crudest early drawings and you can see this something. We just call it the X factor. You're like, yeah, if they stick with it, they'll eventually have it. And then there's other people who can get polished to a pretty high degree of draftsmanship and composition, and you're like, but you'll never be good enough. And I think that's the thing that people don't appreciate about professional comics is you can be 1,000% better than the average person on the street at drawing and still not be good enough. And there's this gray middle where yeah, you are really awesome compared to ordinary people, but you are just not good enough for professional comics. And I think it's the same thing as the NFL, right? Or, whatever major league thing, right? There's those spots, right? And you can be a really tremendous college player who you're going to be the best football player, basketball player that most people will ever meet and still not be good enough to make a living doing it professionally.
Well, when you're talking about art and artists, I mean, so in the industry, you'll hear the word clone thrown around a lot. Oh, this person is kind of a clone of that person. And I think that's something that people don't realize, especially if they don't understand storytelling dynamics. You don't have to be an incredibly polished artist to be able to really tell a dynamic story through art, to be able to do those sequentials. And I think even, like you said, if you're looking at somebody's early work and it's a little bit rough around the edges, but you can see the narrative and there's something original in there. It's not just looking at somebody else's page layout and recreating it. You have to inject something. I think that's why they call it art. You inject something personal in there and your own. I don't know if you'd call it flair or what sort of je ne sais quoi thing it is, but it's there. And Morgan Beam. I looked at her work and I'm like, this is. That was the first I'd seen her stuff. What was on Family Trade? I'm like, this is outstanding. This is incredibly good, and it's completely different than what you would see on your average DC comic, so to speak. And not that there's anything wrong with that; it's all stylistics and aesthetics. But you look at something that's more raw. It's like the difference between an orchestra and punk rock.
Yeah,
and that's probably the best analogy I could come up with it. And I don't think a lot of up and coming artists I don't want to use the word wannabe, but the up and coming comic artists who want a career, who they don't realize that you don't get that by just recreating somebody else's magic, because you never can. You're never going to be able to distill that thing because it's not yours.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting. Most artists that people would argue are kind of a clone of stuff, if they are good enough to be professionals, and they are very stylistically similar, usually rapidly evolve out of it. The most profound example of it probably is Bill Sienkiewicz, right? Like, so if you look at early Bill Sienkiewicz
absolutely.
stuff, he's Neil Adams.
Yeah, yep.
You know,
100%.
but it's interesting to me. So I tried to put together a thing, and I don't think it's going to work out with us, and that's not a negative. But I tried to put together a book with Simone DeMeo, and at the time, if you looked at Simone's art, it was very influenced by James Herron and Trad, which a lot of young artists are. It's funny because James Herron and Trad are like early 30s, so it's not like they're old guys, but like the art influence cycle is so short that you can see a bunch of Trad more. Like you can see like, oh, that's Trad. Like that is somebody who really likes Trad stuff and has done it. But,
and they were writing that first influx of manga, like that first.
Oh yeah.
I call it the Akira wave into American comics. I mean that exists before, but they were some of the ones that were really, really making it happen in their American style work. So.
Oh, absolutely. But and the thing with Simone though is if you look at his stuff now, it absolutely does not look like James Herron or Trad.
Right.
Like, you can see if you're an accomplished enough like art eye, you can still see the dynamism and stuff that's kind of the common core that they have. But like his actual line work and stuff has evolved and that sort of thing. And I think that's the case for most people that are heavily stylistically influenced by people. And you know, you can see that even with people like Dan Panosian and stuff, right? Like his art left to his own devices is not what he was doing in the 90s when he broke in, right? Which was very Liefeldian cut stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, but to go way back to the original question, I do happily get a lot of people sending me work, and I have the really, really lucky position of having a lot more people that want to work with me, not just newbies, but people that are, you know, reasonably established, then I can actually provide projects for, which is a very great place to be, and it works out. Yeah, and it does work out. I'm doing Breaklands over at Comixology, and Taya Seda, the artist on that, was another SCAD person, but he just kind of randomly emailed me one day, and I liked the stuff, and I was like, all right, yeah, I would love to work with you at some point. And it was actually a few years before we came up with the right project, you know, to make that work. But that kind of stuff can happen. And honestly, like these days, like it is a lot less me approaching artists and more I put out the call that I'm looking for whatever, and people just kind of volunteer, and that often kind of works out.
Well, I know you do that on Facebook quite a bit. You'll post, you know, hey, I'm looking for somebody to do this kind of work. Any suggestions? Does that work out sometimes for you?
It does. And it also, so I partly do that. Oftentimes I do have a specific project in mind that I'm trying to find an artist for, but I also sometimes do that just because I like to try and keep abreast of what's going on art-wise, and in a way that I find more difficult than I'm happy with. Trad and I were talking recently about I was trying to put together a book, and I did find an artist for it who's awesome, but I was talking to Trad about it, and I was like, yeah, man, I feel like I'm disconnected from like the up and coming, you know, kids, for lack of a better term. Although, as it happens, the artist that I ended up having on it is relatively new to professional comics, but is not super young. It's not like I pounced on him like I did 20-year-old Trad back in the day.
Yeah.
But Trad and I both realized that we've become like fairly disconnected from like the up-and-comers, and part of that is that stuff like DeviantArt, that was the easy way to find that kind of stuff, just isn't really as functional a thing as it is now. And like Instagram, by just the nature of it, doesn't lend itself as well to that. So the thing you used to be able to do with digital DeviantArt, that was, and you could still do it, but like just people have moved away from DeviantArt, so this is not as effective as it once was. But what you could do is, back when, like, say if Ryan Otley had a DeviantArt account, you could go and look at Ryan Otley's favorites. And what I found was usually true is that people would favorite stuff that was at their level or better. Now, if you did that a couple of like daisy chains out, right? Like you go to a favorite, look at their favorites, look at their favorites, you would eventually get to people who were pro level good, but were not pros yet. And that was a useful thing. Instagram, by just the nature of its algorithm kind of based design and stuff, just makes that hard to do. Like, you can theoretically, and I have done, go to an artist and see who they're following on Instagram. But because Instagram is not solely an art focused sort of thing, there's also a lot of like, oh, I like this band, or I like this actress, or I like whatever.
Right.
And also it's just a more kind of drawn out process to try to do it there. So I had found myself kind of separated from who was doing the really cool art, and it's compounded by the horrible revelation, which I am sure people on the podcast have talked about this before, is that once you start making comics professionally, you have a lot less time to read them.
Right.
And so and there's partly that, and partly that I also have what Marvel and DC particularly are putting out is not really the kind of stuff that I'm interested in reading. They are, and this is not a knock, believe it or not, they are catering to a kind of fan that I am not, which means you have this very continuity heavy, like event focused kind of stuff. And I am just not interested in putting in that level of work for the stories, honestly, is the thing. And so that cycle was kind of out, but like you get like Image and Boom, and I do look at artists and stuff there, but they're also, if you do a really cool art on an Image book, you're going to be hard to get for another project. Like, that's just kind of the nature of the beast sometimes. So I found myself sort of disconnected from that. So some of those calls for art are really that I just want to see what other people think the cool art is, because I recognize that I am not as tuned into that as I once was, and I don't like that. But I have not found a better way to like find and look at new and up and coming artists than doing the periodic sort of calls. You know what I mean? Which is crowdsourcing it basically.
So, Justin, related to that, do you ever look at comic art fans? And I say this just as somebody who, I buy original art, and Craig does as well, and we get commissions. There's a website for anybody out there who doesn't know called Comic Art Fans that allows you to make a profile. It's kind of like DeviantArt used to be, but it's different. It's connected to it, but it allows you to upload scans of your art, and this can be anything from pages from books that were done in the '60s to just somebody cool you met at a small local con who you got a commission from. But it allows you to it categorizes everything, so it allows you to look up people by their name. And it also shows you in real time what people are uploading if you want to see that. And so you can kind of, any given time, get on there and just like look at new uploads and see all kinds of different people. I know this year I've done, I think, 2 or 3 different commissions from individuals I'd never heard of, and got really great work at for a collector standpoint, a really decent price. But is that something you've ever looked at?
Not that in particular, although that's cool. Can you Facebook message me a link to that?
I sure can.
It's funny though. I have gone to like Felix Comic Book Art and like Sequential Essential and Cadence and stuff, and just looked through who they have in their kind of thing of artists, just to get kind of a sense of that sort of stuff too. But the Comic Art Fans thing actually sounds like a good idea. Yeah, it's just, I don't know. It's just, it becomes ever harder to get outside of the silos of information that people were sort of given to you. Like, you know what I mean? That's I've complained about it, not in an art related sense, but it's true there too, of social media very much wants you to stay in these silos of information that they're presenting to you. And if you are looking for something that is specifically new and different, like it is difficult to do. Harder than it sounds like it would be.
The algorithms really are not meant to help you see outside of your own world.
Nope, they are not.
That's a whole different conversation.
For sure.
So before we move on to talk about some of the books and some of the things you have going on, because I absolutely want to chat about that and kind of promote it for anybody who hasn't dipped into it, because it's phenomenal. One question I kind of wanted to ask you, since we're on the topic of style, since we're talking about these artists who kind of have their own riff on things, do you think that that's been a kind of a risk? And I know in your case, I think it's paid off more than not. But as a writer who's looking for somebody who's not doing Marvel, and I'm using air quotes again, but podcast. So not doing Marvel style and not doing DC house style stuff. Is that do you consider that a risk, or is it something that it's kind of is it a risk, or is it an adventure?
Both. I
Yeah.
don't think you get adventure without risk for the most
Right.
part. It is a risk, and and that's one of those things that I was actually thinking about it when I was giving that extremely long answer to the question you asked earlier, which is the other thing that's a bummer is that you will find people, and this actually happens fairly often to me, is you find people who are great at what they do and they have uh, awesome storytelling and great draftsmanship and all that, but their style is just so outside of what you can sell, certainly to Marvel and DC, but even within the direct market, like there's some stuff that's just like a huge gamble. And for me, just ethically, it's one of those things where, yeah, like, so if it's something somebody's got a really out there but cool style, but they are, but would say we do an Image Central book, like there's this ethical question of, if we do this book with that style, there's a very good chance none of us will make any money, and that's fine. I work on enough stuff that I am generally okay. Like, it's a whole other thing to be like the artist on the other side of that, putting hundreds of hours of work into it and stuff. And if they're cool with it, cool. But like, you do also need to be aware that like this is probably just going to be money, work that is not going to make them any money, and it's not a function of their skill. It's just a function of being outside what is sort of acceptable and that kind of stuff. And yeah, sometimes you take chances. So like, for instance, take Sombra that I did at Boom. I did that with Earl Trevino,
Mm-hmm.
and he's got this great manga style, and I liked what he did on the book, and I would not have done otherwise. But I will also say that that book almost certainly would have sold better with a different artist, just because, given the context of what we were doing, that kind of manga style thing, telling this extremely dark story, it's just going to be a hard sell in the direct market. It just is. And I've had that with a number of artists. I back in the day, I put together at least one, and I think we actually probably did 2 or 3 pitches together with Anthony Peruzzo, who is an artist, and he's got a great style, but it is not a mainstream style. Like, it just isn't. And that goes the other direction too, right? Like, if you're working in kind of the Fantagraphics world, that sort of literary,
Yeah,
comics kind of
drawn and
stuff,
quarterly.
drawn and quarterly. If you have Trad Moore's style, you are going to have a hard go doing
Right.
those kind of books. You know what I mean? So yeah, that is absolutely a risk, and it's one of those things where I, for sure, like, I almost always tend to more stylized sort of art. Like, the closer art gets to like photorealism, the less I am interested.
Right.
So I am, and that has mostly worked out very well for me. But there is also, anytime there is an element of risk to that, the further out you get from that, the more, the further you get away from like Marvel and DC, the more of a risk it is. And that's true in a lot of ways. Like, the reason that one of the reasons, anyhow, that Trad has done so much and so well at Marvel is simply that for a very long time, DC was just not interested in what Trad was doing.
Yeah.
And that's a stylistic choice. It was not, nothing else. Just nobody there could see him drawing Batman, even though he literally has drawn Batman for their digital thing. So, that's
it's baffling because they've got another amazing artist, Mitch Gerards, who is not something that you typically see. His style is not a historically DC style. It's different, but it's and I guess that just speaks to editorial leadership and what what they're looking for the entirety of the line.
Yeah. Yep, that is absolutely true. So with Mitch in particular, he got. I am going to say he got lucky, and that is true, but let me qualify that lest it sound dismissive. I don't think they would have allowed Tom and Mitch to do Mr. Miracle and Batman stuff and all that if they had not done Sheriff of Babylon.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I don't think, you know what I mean? Like, and so I think it's one of those things where like that they kind of got backdoored in to being able to do that. I think Mitch's style actually works really well for some kinds of superhero stuff.
Mhm.
And I thought he was a good mix with the Punisher back in the day, and he'd be a good mix for. Hey, it was great on Mr. Miracle and that kind of stuff. But I think if Mitch were, you know, if Tom were writing Mr. Miracle and hadn't done Sheriff of Babylon and all that stuff and said, I want Mitch Gerrits, he would probably have had a much more difficult time if they hadn't had that Vertigo experience first.
I don't think anybody can disagree with that. I think that's absolutely true. Well, all right, let's talk about some of the meat and potatoes of your work, especially the two things that, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, the two main things you have shooting out in the world right now are Reaver, which you're doing with Rebecca Isaacs, and one of my favorite colorists in the game, Alex Ramirez, and Urban Animal with John Amore, who I've actually gotten to be a really good friend with online. Great guy. I love what he's doing.
John, good people.
And just genuine as all hell.
Oh, yeah.
Love that guy. So talk a little bit about both of those, if you don't mind. Like, lead it into it, and then I'm sure, especially with Reaver, Matt is probably, I don't know if he has any fingernails left. He's been itching to talk to you about Reaver.
Yeah, so Reaver, so sadly, neither Rebecca nor Alex are on the second arc of the book. And Rebecca, we had a communication. I say we, I mean it was everyone, and it's not like a veiled we don't get along kind of thing. When Rebecca signed on to Reaver, it was unclear to her that the book was going to be ongoing. So scheduling issues came into play because she ended up committing to something else afterwards. So we got Nico Henriksen on, and if you're not familiar with Nico, he's done a bunch of stuff, but I think probably what you would recognize is Beasts of Baghdad with Brian K. Vaughan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Remembering the title correctly. And Nico does his own watercolor work, so unfortunately, like, that also meant that Alex didn't have a place, which is a shame because I really like Alex and he does tremendous work. So I hope to be able to work with both him and Rebecca actually again in the future. Yeah, Reaver has worked out well for me, and Reaver is a lot of fun to write. So for those who aren't familiar with Reaver, it's basically grimdark fantasy, which is not a term I just made up. It is a specific subgenre of fantasy that takes place in a more gritty, kind of cynical world. So a lot of people would debate it, but if you want to think the kinds of worlds that The Witcher and Game of Thrones take place in versus something more idealized like Lord of the Rings, it's that kind of difference. Like, basically, if your people are fucking and guts are falling out, it's probably grimdark. if they are tastefully courting, you're probably looking at high fantasy. So Reaver was basically me looking at particularly one of the big people in kind of grimdark fantasy, and amusingly his Twitter handle, I think, is Lord Grimdark, is a writer called Joe Abercrombie, who has done the First Law books, and I just love his books. And Reaver is damn near First Law fan fiction. It was just me looking at his stuff and being like, I really like what he's doing, so I want to do that. And there's also, you know, I'll get into the business side of it. People sometimes react well to that stuff and sometimes don't because it sounds very mercenary, because it is. But the nature of it is I'm always have so many ideas and working on so many things that a lot of what gets a project bumped up to the top of the queue is the business side of it, right? So with Reaver, I wanted to do grimdark fantasy, and I had this idea of doing grimdark fantasy takes on other genres, right? So the first arc of Reaver, which I'll talk about a little more in a second, is very much the Dirty Dozen in Westeros. It's explicitly like a Suicide Squad military mission taking place in the fantasy world. That is by design. The second arc of it is essentially a film noir story taking place in the fantasy world. And the third arc is meant to be a Western taking place in the fantasy world. So
Sweet.
yeah, so that was the remit. But I also looked at what was on the market. I had the idea, and I was like, I want to do this. All right. I looked at the market, and I was like, you know what? There was, at the time this was pitched, this was before Conan came back at Marvel. But, like, generally, there was fantasy on the market, but there was not fantasy of this kind. And I also knew that this sort of fantasy was doing gangbusters in prose, which made me think there's probably an audience for it. And that was kind of how I pitched Skybound on it. And so I lucked out, and it's done really well for us. So, you know, I am pleased that I was either both lucky and good, or one of the two. But yeah, it was that sort of thing.
Well,
so yeah,
FYI, the three of us will always be a market for that genre.
excellent. Yeah, it is my preferred way to do fantasy too. I do like high fantasy sometimes, but I really like the more kind of blood and guts, cynical aspects of it. I think that's probably just kind of built into how I roll. So the first arc of Reaver, as I said, it's called Hell's Half Dozen, and it's basically they take this world. So I mentioned this if you read the single issues, I mentioned that it's actually based on, while the world is a fantasy world, the situation is actually based on the U.S. right after the revolution against the English. So you've essentially got this country that just declared itself its own country, but you've still got these kind of colonial imperial interests that are still there and are still kind of fighting. So the two of those are clashing, and one of them has realized that they can use magic to get a strategic advantage, and the other one realizes that, oh, we need to stop them. So they send this group of criminals that they picked out of their military prison on a suicide mission to stop this. And it kind of factors into what Reaver is ultimately about, which is when you get to Reaver. So one of the things about fantasy worlds that always, I won't say it always trips me up, but very often, like, the magic aspects of it are not integrated into the world. And there's this thing where, okay, you've got magic, and if it doesn't have a price, then the world should look like this, and it rarely does.
Right.
You know, it's one of those deals where, like, if you can use magic to teleport from place to place and there's no limitations on it, then the society should look different. It shouldn't have horses and carts the same way, or there should be an explanation why not. So when I was constructing the world that Reaver takes place in, the idea was magic always takes more than it gives, but it doesn't have to be you that pays the cost. So in Reaver, like, and basically there's kind of a group of native people, many groups, that are aware of magic, and they have reached kind of an equilibrium because they understand this. They understand that it is going to cost you more than you can get out of it, but sometimes that cost is worth the sacrifice. But when an imperial kind of colonial power gets a hold of that and realizes, oh, we can just start feeding it, what you're basically looking at is the industrialization of magic. So in the context of this world, this is essentially one side has just realized they can build nuclear weapons, and the other side is trying to stop them. And as it goes on, that's failed. Like, so what the whole book is about the spread of this industrialized magic and the overall goal of who turns out to be the overall protagonist of the thing is to stop this from happening by any means necessary.
How did you develop the characters for the first arc?
Well, so what the book was originally pitched as was, it was supposed to be something more like what Brian Wood did with Northlanders, which was, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Northlanders or your readers are.
Oh, yeah.
Our listeners are. But yeah, so with Northlanders, he's basically telling Viking stories, but there's not any one main character, and there's not a straight chronology through it. Like, they're all taking place in the same world, and you can put together a chronology, but it doesn't mean that Arc 2 happens after arc 1, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it was supposed to be like that. And one of the main characters was, of course, was Essen Breaker, and he was sort of one of the recurring characters that was supposed to happen. And so what actually is the second arc was supposed to be, when I originally conceived it, the first arc, and then the second arc would have been the first arc and would have shown how he got to where the second arc has him. And then I just realized that, yeah, honestly, saying it's the Dirty Dozen in Westeros, Suicide Squad in Westeros, is just going to make it much easier to sell without artistically really changing much. So I just rolled with that. And I mean, and that seems to have worked. So yeah, so it was kind of one of those things where once I started with that, it was a matter of sort of, it's the same as any project. I am very much a story first kind of writer, by which I mean I usually have an idea and a concept, and then I kind of have an idea of where it begins and ends, and then I am sort of back engineering characters that will get me from point A to point B, rather than some writers have the idea for a character and they're like, yeah, I want to create this guy who's basically, Gregor Clegane if he tried to go straight, and I'll build adventures around them, which is arguably what Reaver is. But like that's not the position I started from. I sort of knew what I wanted it to do and worked backwards from it. And I sort of did that with kind of all the characters, basically to, they are designed in any given arc to let me show sort of the aspects of the world that I want to get across to the reader and make the plot work. And that's not as straightforward as it sounds, because that's the simplified version. What you find in practice for me is that once I start writing characters, they also affect what the plot will be, just based on how you've established they're going to act. But it usually starts with the story, create the characters for it, and then the characters kind of recursively influence the story. And then sometimes you just like characters and kind of keep them around. So, like, honestly, like, I'm going to give you spoilers for Reaver. No, maybe I shouldn't. There's a character who survives who was not originally supposed to, but I just like the character so much and figured out that they fit well into the world and contrasted well with other stuff that I wanted to doing, that it was more sensible to keep them around. So that kind of stuff happens too.
Your setting and your plot affects your characters. Like, these are, especially if you're doing it well, this is a world in which they exist that it influences who they are, and in turn their reactions to things influences the direction of the narrative. So I mean, I think that has to happen. And when you look at what a lot of writers do, who are more plot heavy, they don't let me actually go backwards. Writers who are more character heavy, where the plot doesn't play such an integral role to the hero's journey, or to the fleshing out, solving whatever internalized problem that they have, you don't need the world necessarily to be tangible, because it's almost everything is internalized. By you going with the plot, and this is just, again, from my takeaway from it, you going with plot and narrative and story first allows you to get the texture that translates so well to the characterization of the person. But one thing that you do really well is you go back and you also dive deep into character. And a lot of fantasy writers won't do that. They'll give you, they'll give you the stat sheet, if we're going like analyzing to D&D, but they don't necessarily give you a lot of the backstory and the history. There's not a lot of subtext to them. You do that. I mean, you've done that in Reaver, definitely, with characters like Essen Breaker and Raquela. I think that's how you pronounce her name. That's how in my head canon it is. But you did that in Family Trade as well. And interesting, and at least from my perspective, is you do that with characters that aren't necessarily projections of yourself. These are characters who are women, characters who are people of color, characters who are queer in some aspect or another. And you're able to do that, which, by the way, is no small feat, especially in today's world where people can get really upset when that's done poorly, and rightly so. But you're able to do that with a sense of authority, so to speak. I don't know if authority is the right word, but you do it, and you do it really well, which a lot of people don't, if that makes sense.
does, and thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I work hard at that. And it's it's always one of those things where I am always cautious about approaching characters that are not me, but at the same time, like I so there are two reasons my stuff often features characters who are queer or people of color or that kind of stuff, and part of it is that I certainly over the years have come to really appreciate in a way that younger me probably wouldn't have how much representation does matter.
Mhm.
And that can be in kind of subtle ways. Like honestly, like the whole genesis of Jack, Fat Jack in Spread, the basic core of that character is that there are shockingly few badass fat guys in fiction. It's just not a thing, right?
We need representation too.
That's the thing. Like, I mean, I am more slender than I once was, but like, you know, I grew up and I was always physically strong and I was fairly athletic, but I was also, you know, 100 pounds overweight probably for a lot of it. And so I never saw me, despite the fact that in many respects, being a straight white Christian male in America, I am way represented. But if you get into the weeds of like badass fat guys, like that is not a thing. That rarely happens. That's, you know, arguably some Brian Dennehy stuff, and I don't think I would actually call Brian Dennehy fat. But, you know, so but things like that got me thinking about, you know, just the kind of the empathy of like looking at like, oh yeah, like yes, that one specific thing is not super representative. You know, there's not a good representative of me, but in many other aspects of my identity, I am way overrepresented, right? So like I got to be thinking about I actually do think it's important to show other people than what is just the standard baseline in storytelling kind of stuff. That's my relatively empathetic and altruistic reason for it. The more selfish reason for doing it is that I just get bored as fuck of writing people that are like me. You know, and some of that is just to keep myself interested as a writer, and I just find the mental challenge of trying to put myself in the headspace of someone who is not me more interesting. And obviously not very few, if any, of my characters are very representative of me, right? Like Luther Strode is not Justin Jordan. Like, actually, if anything, I'm probably closer to Petra, which is, you know, you can analyze that at your leisure. But that character is not super like me, but he's within the range of me. Whereas when you take people like No or like Jessa from the Family Trade, and you know that kind of stuff, or Rakala from that, you are getting further and further away from my lived experience, and that's interesting as a writer. It is also possibly fraught with peril because I also realize that I am a straight white dude, and so I can get away with elbowing my way into those spaces, and I don't want to do that. I want to, and the line I've come for myself, which so far seems to have got me in good stead, because I have not gotten any shit over the years for the choices I've made. But the line that I've given myself is, I feel it is important to include, for me to write characters that are not straight white dudes, but I don't want to write what it is about the experience of being something that I am not, which sounds weird, but which is to say, No, for instance, No in Spread is an Asian gay dude, which I wish I had made the gay part more explicit. But because I'm at the risk of J.K. Rowling that shit. But I assure you, it was always there from the beginning, and there are clues in the narrative that it's the case. But it is not about him being an Asian guy or being a gay man. You know what I mean? And I realize that distinction is subtle, but that's like in Urban Animal, there is a trans character, and I feel comfortable writing a trans character even though I am not a trans person, but I would not write about the trans experience.
Right.
That is not something I could do well, and I honestly don't think it's my place to do it also. So there's that fine line of trying to like balance those two kind of competing competing things out. And I think I've done okay with it. Like I said, people don't. I get a lot of positive praise for it often in DMs and that kind of stuff. To go back to No, I've had a few younger LGBTQ people cotton on to the fact that No was gay, and we're really happy about it. And it's the same way with I've gotten some messages from people who, before we made it somewhat more explicit in Urban Animal, got that Fletcher was a trans man, and wrote me to talk about how much they appreciated that kind of stuff. And that is incredibly gratifying. Like I'm not gonna lie, like as a writer, we love praise, so that's great. And I've not had anybody jump on me, so I think I'm probably doing okay. But yeah, it is something I give a great deal of thought to. I'm a pretty thoughtful writer in general on those aspects of things in particular I think about. And there are things where, honestly, I am hesitant to say this just because I understand how kind of tiny violin sort of thing it is. There are also things that I am wary about, maybe more than I should be. And so, for instance, I wish both, and we've tried to do more of this in the second arc of Reaver, but I wish there were, on one hand, I wish there were more people of color in Reaver. On the other hand, everybody in Reaver is terrible, right? Like, to some extent. So it's one of those things like, even though this is a fictional thing, people are still going to compare it to like the real world. And like, it's one of those things where like Rakalla's people, the Real, are vaguely approximate to Native Americans, but like they are very explicitly meant to be Celtic looking folks. Because even though it's a fantasy setting, if we make them Native American-like, people are going to see them as a proxy for Native Americans, and I'm aware of that. And it's the same way within Urban Animal. Like, while that cast is fairly multi-ethnic, Joe, the main character, is Filipino, as is John, the artist, and Paulo is Puerto Rican, and it is less obvious from the art. Just because of John's style, but Charlotte is meant to be half Japanese, so we've got that. But like, I am also aware that there are essentially no black people in that book, and or in the series, and that is something that like I also want to remedy. But like at the same time, I also am real cognizant of like, well, I don't want them to just show up and die, and like, so like in the second season of that, like in retrospect, I should probably, and again, here's this overanalyzing kind of aspect of it. There's Sienna, the new character, and there's no reason she couldn't be African American, except that, one, when I originally conceived the character, I thought she was going to die in the second season, and that proved to not be a good choice anyhow. So I also didn't want to introduce an African American character and kill them. And two, she also has some insight into how nature and all that kind of stuff works. And so I didn't want to get into the magical, I'm going to say African-American trope. That is not how it is usually phrased, but there's the thing that Stephen King fucking loves to do. Right? So there's all those things, and like that is stuff to which I give, as this long answer makes clear, a great deal of thought.
Well, I mean, the fact that you think about that in general puts you, I think it separates you from a lot of folks. And our listeners know I'm a very open, and as well, I'm a very openly gay man. But I'm also not I can walk down the street without getting quote unquote clocked. And so having that not be the forefront of a character like No, having that not to be his story, like separate from that means a lot, because like you said, you're not writing about the experience of that identity. You're writing about the experience of somebody who lives in the world.
Yeah.
And that means a lot. Like seeing somebody who that is not the entirety of their story is refreshing, because it normalizes those experiences and those existences in a world that doesn't allow them or us to be normal, if that makes sense.
It does, and that is absolutely what I'm trying to go for and that kind of stuff. And I think that is probably the only way for somebody in just to annoy some people, a position of privilege, which I absolutely am, to approach that kind of thing. As I think it needs to be that kind of storytelling,
Right.
and I think I think there are probably still, people could take issue with that, and maybe justifiably, there's this idea that there's this fine balance, and I don't know to what extent this is going to be self-justifying, right? Like, I don't know that within myself. On one hand, you could say it would be awesome to have more African American people of color, queer people in comics, in creative, in film, and all that, and that is 1,000% true. What is also true is that is not the world which we currently inhabit, business-wise, the real world. And if you have a thing that is dominated by exclusively, not exclusively, or predominantly white people, straight people, etc., and they are not doing those kind of stories, then you are locking that representation out. Like, right? Like, the ideal is not what you have. So it's a matter of like dealing with the situation you got rather than the situation you would want to have. Now, to me, that could be self-justifying me telling these kind of stories, right? Like if somebody is a person of color or is queer and comes up and says, "Yeah, you're full of shit," they might be right, right? Like, I think I'm trying to do the right thing, and I think my heart's in the right place, and I think I am doing something that is objectively good, but there's also always that level of self-doubt, you know what I mean? And that's tricky, and that's one of those deals. It's like, it is important, it is more important, it is more important to have representation in the creators, but it is also important to have representation in the creative process. And so where does that leave you when the creators are underrepresented? You know what I mean? Like, there's that whole ethical dimension to it. I'm very far into the weeds there.
No, I love it. Are you kidding? I think we all love it. That's one of the reasons we've been itching to talk to you, is because you will go into the weeds on those things. Speaking of experiences that aren't of yours, or they might be, are you in fact a young punk rock chimera?
I am not.
So
I am not any of those things.
I don't know. I'd argue that you're a little bit punk rock.
That's probably fair.
Yeah, I'll give you. I mean, you're like at least the last time I saw you, you were kind of in the mode of like a Ginger Allen Moore look going on. So that you had that working. So Urban Animal is something, and actually it ties into what you were talking about a little bit ago with an artist who is outside of the mainstream, who wouldn't necessarily work. I don't know if he would work well or not in the direct market, but you guys have found a market outside of that, and that's through webtoons. With Urban Animal, number one, that book, or you can't even call it I don't know what you call it. That comic is outstanding. It is.
I always default to calling it a book, even though it isn't. So I'm right there with you. Go on.
No, it's a really fun adventure, but it also it is neat for me as somebody who looks in the weeds, who looks outside of things, looking beyond the direct market and finding these comic readers who aren't inside the comic shops and who will invest in comics if it's accessible to them and in a way that they know, which, if you're under 25, I don't think you know what a world is like without a computer in front of you. I think I'm 32, so I think I was one of the last generations of people who can remember analog.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so, but my little brother, who's 10 years younger than me, doesn't know what a world without internet is. And so, number one, talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about just kind of where Urban Animal came from, because it's an insane little ride, but also like what it's like as somebody who's got a foot both in the direct market world and in the, I don't even know what you call it, the world outside the direct market, because we talk to a lot of creators who are one or the other, right? Like, so we can talk to people who are inside the direct market all day long, and then we can talk to people who are indie folks. But you kind of have, I don't know if unique is the right word or singular, but you are one of the few people who has a really, really good foundation in both.
Yeah, it's been interesting. So Urban Animal started as a project of John's, John Moore. So John and I have known each other for a long time. John and I go back to at least 2007, and it might be earlier. We have actually put together a number of pitches that did not get picked up, which actually goes into what you were saying about the style thing. It is not and has never been that John's not a tremendous artist, because John is an amazingly good artist. But what he does, even when he pushes it towards a more mainstream direct market kind of style, which he can, it's still not what Marvel and DC typically do. There are exceptions, right? Like I could see them putting him on a Robin book or putting him on, Power Pack or that kind of stuff. But I think that's what they're going to default with him. But that has, kind of been an issue with John and I getting projects together over the years. But we have never lost contact. We've been friends and we've talked regularly for, going on 15 years now. And he had first hit. So originally, Urban Animal was called Beast Boy Joe, which has its own set of problems. And there's a reason that it eventually mutated into Urban Animal. Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, that was John actually didn't know about Beast Boy when he was doing the character. But the similarities are, a little too much to lean into actually saying that. And he came up with this idea, and I was, familiar. I'd read the other iterations that he's done a little bit with Joe and that kind of character, and then he switched it to Urban Animal and would do it. And he had done some comics and stuff that were Urban Animal related. They were not the version that we've got now, but they were. He would often sketch the character and that sort of thing, and so we a couple of years ago, I started getting associated with the people at Webtoons back when they were trying to, beginning to move into the American market. And I had weaseled my way into going to some dinners with them and stuff, as you do. And as I do, which I don't necessarily recommend, I got the email of the highest up person on the food chain that I could find. And I said, hey, I want to pitch you some books. And they said, okay. And so I went and looked at, and again, this is going to come into the kind of business aspect of it as well. I went and, I had looked at what Webtoons did and what performed well at Webtoons. And I was like, oh yeah, John is perfect for this. And John liked Webtoons far before I did. And so we looked at it together, and we put together a project that we did pitch. It was not Urban Animal, and it was wrong for Webtoons. It's a good project. It was a book called Travelers, and it basically presented that the human race had kind of been forced to get into these like Jawa sandcrawler kind of moving towns to stay on the run from this threat. Blah blah blah, and it was a cool concept. Mortal Engines is close enough to what we were doing that it's probably a dead project at this point, but it is also wrong for Webtoons. It is just visually, it is the kind of thing that requires a different kind of canvas than Webtoons typically offers you. And Webtoons said exactly that, and they were right. So I was like, went back to John. I was like, he's like, well, how about Urban Animal? And I was like, okay. And so I took the basic concept that he had, which was, that Joe was a nature spirit called a chimera. Well, it actually wasn't called chimera yet. It was just called something else. And I came up with this sort of mythology and the way the story could kind of go. And then John and I built that together, and then we pitched that to Webtoons. And that was custom designed to work with the Webtoons format. I put a lot of sweat equity, as did John, into reverse engineering what made Webtoons kind of stuff work, both on the page and creatively to a certain point.
Right.
The fact that Urban Animal features teenagers, that there's romance in it, that it's got John as the artist, all that, none of that is a coincidence. That is all us working to do what webtoons likes, and I don't mean the company, I mean webtoons reader and that sort of stuff, and it's worked out well for us. With all these things, I can never quite parse how much of that is me being lucky and how much of it is, actual intelligence. But in either case, it's kind of worked out for us. And it's been interesting. Yeah, I by design, so I've looked at, and if you follow me on Facebook, as I know you do, you will have seen me ramble on about this on any number of occasions, but I've looked at the US market for comics. And by comics, I mean sequential storytelling. And the direct market is what we, as in you, probably you, definitely me. When we say comics, we mean the direct market. We mean Marvel, DC, Image, Boom, etc. That is comics. Comic shops is what we're talking about. That is not what comics is. And indeed, that is the smallest market in the US market, overall market for sequential storytelling. You've got, and there's, you can make a Venn diagram about these things because there's some overlap. But you've absolutely got the manga market, you've got the bookstore library market, and you've got web comics, and then you've got the direct market. And the other three markets, or, four, if you want to separate out bookstore and library, but for convenience sake, I will say they're all one. Vastly more readers than you get in mainstream comics, just by factors of magnitudes. As a way of, for instance, specific to Urban Animal, last I checked, it had 396,000 subscribers, and we have a weekly audience of around 100K people. And of course, that's not apples to apples, because they are by and large not paying for it. But we do have FastPass, and we get enough people paying for FastPass, which allows you to pay 50 cents to read episodes early. We have enough people doing that if that many people were buying an Image comic, we would be a solid hit. We wouldn't be Saga, we wouldn't be Wicked and Divine, but we'd be operating at like a Chew level, right?
That's outstanding.
Yeah, it really is. And so that's just the sheer scale of that audience. And then if you look at bookstore and that kind of stuff, a lot of that stuff is skewed towards middle grade and YA, right? So it's sort of a different thing. But
the Raina Telgemeier people.
Raina Telgemeier, yeah. Dave Pilkey. Dave Pilkey in 2018 sold 700,000 copies of a single title. He sold 2.3 million Dogman books overall. And Dogman books are absolutely comics. There is no calling them anything but comic books. They are designed for young readers, but they are comic books. And
it amazes me the number of people who are comics fans who, again, they don't know anything outside of the LCS system. They, like you say, Raina Telgemeier, and they kind of gloss over. They've never heard the name, and it's just like, there's a whole broad world and money to be made out there for that.
There absolutely is, and it's one of those things where I've looked at my career, and I've looked at career longevity, and I've looked at where the market is, and I have made a conscious decision to reach out into those other markets. And so in the last 2 years, I've done Urban Animal at Webtoons. I'm doing web comics. I've done it's supposed to be 2 graphic novels for the Twitch, was Twitch. I don't know what he switched to now, but Ninja the Gamer. So that's a bookstore direct market thing. I've got another GN that's going to be out at some point. And I've done, Breaklands at Comixology, which is a digital first sort of animal. And all of that was conscious design to be outside of the direct market. It is not that I dislike the direct market, because I don't. I fucking love comic book shops, and I love floppies, which apparently is fraught with peril, even calling them that. I love single issue comics. I love comic book shops. I love all that.
Well, there's no adventure without risk, like you said.
Exactly. And but I've also realized that where the most growth is happening and where the readers are is outside of that. And I also have an as yet unconfirmed theory, which is the people that are reading Dave Pilkey and the people that are reading Raina Telgemeier, which are not the same people, right? Raina is operating in a YA space, and Dave is operating in a young readers space, but that whole contingent of readers is going to want something different than slice of life YA or that at some point.
Absolutely.
And I am trying to position myself to be someone who is providing essentially genre stuff for them, which is to say, there isn't really the YA graphic novel or new adult graphic novel equivalent of stuff like the Hunger Games, right? And I don't mean dystopian. I mean stuff that is 1000% genre. You know, Hunger Games is unabashedly dystopian sci-fi.
Right.
And it is absolutely that. And it is also for that thing. That kind of stuff is really underserved in comics in that market, right?
Mhm.
So if you can convince publishers to do it, there is growth and space there. And I think in terms of career longevity, like that is one of the things I'm looking at. I mean, it's not a matter of turning my back on the direct market because I don't intend to do so, but it is also the awareness that at some point the direct market is very likely going to turn its back on me. And it is also a matter of expanding sort of the safety net. And frankly, right now, with the COVID thing, the reason that I am relatively secure for a relatively long time is because I've done all that.
Yeah, you've diversified your portfolio, which is something that anybody wants to do in whatever your money making endeavors are.
Yeah, and it is paid off. You know, I mean, like that's a lot of my income is coming from non-direct market comic book sources for the foreseeable future. And had I not started doing that before the COVID thing, I would not be screwed because I'm financially prudent and have the ability to be financially prudent. But I would be more screwed if I hadn't done that. And as terms of staying in comics for the long term, I think that is a kind of a necessary component. Now that's the business and career aspect of it. The other part of it is that those markets also have different expectations about how you're telling a story sequentially, which I'm finding to be very satisfying to write. And honestly, for as much as I do actually love single issues, I think my writing is better when I'm either doing webtoons or graphic novels. I think so. I have this philosophy that I need to do. So whatever chunk you're consuming something in, that chunk of something needs to be satisfying on its own. It doesn't need to be complete.
Yep.
But you need to walk away feeling like you were entertained and you've got this thing. Not just that it stops, or not just that it's decompressed to the point of absurdity. So whenever I'm writing for 20 odd page, usually 20, but 20 to 24 page single issue comics, I am writing to that rhythm. And I oddly find that more, I'm not sure if restrictive is the word I want, but I'm going to go with restrictive. I find that more restrictive than writing for graphic novels, which is obvious because you don't have that same kind of rhythm. But also the hyper serialized webtoon stuff is also more freeing, oddly enough, than that 20-page sort of chunk. But also some of it goes into, and this is particularly interesting with like webtoons, is the audience expectations are different. So in webtoons, I can have two characters talking about their feelings for a much longer interval than would be acceptable in a single issue comic in the direct market. Some people can sometimes get away with that, but like in my experience, like the audience is just, they're there for it, and they are there for the romance and the friendship and that kind of stuff. And I'm able to dedicate more space to that emotional kind of aspect of things in a way that, both because of my own sort of story design philosophy and because of what I feel the demands of that readership are, than I can in direct market stuff. So working in those other markets has actually been super satisfying from a creative standpoint as well, and I think has made me a better writer overall.
That comes through, and I'm a rising tide lifts all ships, right? So like if you do well in one aspect, those improvements in storytelling they're going to affect the floppies, or the single issues, or your trades. Like it's all making you a better craftsman, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. I certainly hope so.
No, I'm saying that is, obviously I brought you on here to heap praise upon you. That's what we do. But it's not untrue. And what you're saying about the feeling and stuff, that's something, even writers like, we mentioned him earlier, Tom King and Mitch Gerards, like the complaints for what they are that I hear from people, mostly quote unquote fanboys, are that they spend too much time, like, just get on with it. Like, I don't understand Mr. Miracle because it's like, what are all these pages of, like, the internality of it all. That's not something that they're looking for in those books. So, man, we have had you on here for a hot minute, and I have absolutely loved every minute of it. What's kind of coming down the pipeline for you now? Anything that you can tell us, or hey, if you want to break news on here, maybe we can get a retweet from I'm not going to say their name; they don't pay me money. So, what's happening in your world post COVID when everything kicks back off? What's going on?
Well, so Urban Animal will be back this summer. We're currently on hiatus between seasons 2 and 3, and we are. I think I'm allowed to mention it, but we are also actually greenlit through season 4, so there will be at least another 50 episodes of Urban Animal. So
That is
nice.
outstanding.
And if Webtoons yells at me about that, well, I'll just have to take it. But they've not told me I couldn't tell people that. So, Reaver second arc is coming out. I think we're in this weird position that I think the first issue may actually have hit the stands right before everything shut down.
It did.
It did, yeah.
That is very frustrating. So we'll see where that goes when that picks back up. The next iteration of Dead Body Road starts sometime. It was supposed to start this month. It may still be. I am just out of the loop on when the release schedule on that is happening. But that series, the Dead Body Road Bad Blood, which is the sequel, is maybe the best scripts that I feel I've ever written.
Wow.
It hits this sweet spot for me, and of course it's subjective, and readers may not feel that way, but it gets into the sweet spot where I am doing a crime story, which I love to do crime, in general, but also in fiction. And I am doing a crime story, which I love and don't get to do super often. And it's actually set in rural Pennsylvania, where I'm from. And it is me kind of tapping into my love of like Elmore Leonard and Justified and all that kind of stuff. So it hits a real good spot where I feel like all the action and emotional beats and stuff are really like coming together. So I'm very pleased with it, and I'm glad that people finally get to read it. And then I have recently just signed a contract to do a mini series that'll be out TBD at some point. That one's interesting, and I can't talk about it at length, but we are, in light of COVID, exploring doing some interesting distribution stuff. So it'll be exciting to talk about it when we can. The concept is really cool, and the artist that we've got attached to it is awesome. So I'm hoping people dig it. So that should be coming sometime, honestly, probably in 2021. And that's just the life cycle of comics, like even outside of COVID. It's like I got exciting stuff coming in like a year, like that. And I think that's probably all I've got going on comic book wise. Outside of comics, I've got some interesting stuff happening. I'm working on, as of this week, I'm working on a script for a Luther Strode movie, which has not. So it is a legit production company, but we've not signed any official things. So it's in this kind of stasis bit where like basically it won't hurt me to have written the script, and if it doesn't work out with this production company, then like they don't own anything. It's not one of those kind of deals. But if they can package the script and the property together, then it'll be good for me. So I'm doing that. I also
kind of a first look kind of thing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nice.
And I also recently got hooked up with a huge name television producer, which I can't tell you, but I can guarantee you that you and all of your listeners have watched stuff that this person has created. And they wanted to adapt one of my comics, and the company they have a exclusive deal with likes the comic but didn't want to do it. So they actually were like, the producer was like, I still really like your stuff. We should try and develop stuff together. So I've been talking to them about developing other stuff, and that is still sort of ticking along. And again, like anything, that might come to nothing, but it's exciting. And both of those have been kind of slowed down by the whole COVID sort of thing. Just
right.
Because Hollywood is kind of, also in stasis and that sort of stuff. So yeah, I mean it's good stuff. Like if any of that pans out the way I hope it will, it'll be be a good couple of years. But yeah, it's just weird being in this kind of like gray zone of like maybe, maybe not. Nobody's making decisions right now. Like
yeah.
Look at you all grown up, man.
I know.
I am both
passed for a functioning adult.
I am both proud and of for you. And it's not like you weren't already on your way, but you have come such a long way since I first met you. Like I said, I think it was 2012 when you photobombed me.
Right.
So you've come such a long way, man. It's been great watching your career. And dude, you'll have to do us a favor when these things finally hit, and you can talk about them. Come back on. Well, I know we would all love to have you back on. This has been so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah,
this
it's
has
been great.
Super fun. I'd love to come back on.
For anybody who doesn't know, if you think that Justin, that he could use a few more of your dollar bills, one thing you can do is go on Patreon, and you can support him on Patreon. I know a couple of us do, and
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I was actually gonna bring that up.
Okay.
He's got some tremendous tiers on there. Get on there and check it out. I'm on the one where you get everything signed by him. It's fantastic.
I am on the I'm a broke law student tier. So, mine comes with a little asterisk, and that asterisk says paid for by Fannie Mae. So but
it's just when crime finally catches up to me, hopefully you'll be through law school.
I am investing in your future, you are investing in my future. It's a circle. No, seriously, man. We love talking to you. Love having you on. Hopefully, when this all gets cleared up, we'll get to see each other at a con again.
God, I hope so. I miss you guys.
I miss you too, buddy. Man,
it'd be nice to see you again. No, just thanks for coming on, Justin. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. It's been great.
Yeah, I really appreciate you guys having me on. This was super fun. So thanks again.
All right, brother. Well, you give Tom Waits all the love from all of us.
That is literally what I'm going to do right now. So.
Dramatic pause. Dramatic pause.
Is it still dramatic pause if you say it out loud?
That's part of the drama.
Is that kind of like going awkward silence, awkward silence?
Well, holy shit, that was fun.
That was a ton of fun.
My man hit the ground running. Like I was gonna intro him. I was gonna give his catalog, his list of things, but nah, son, he just wanted to talk.
Well, I mean, Jeremy did the same thing, right? They come on and immediately it's like, they're ready to go. They're ready to talk when we get them on.
Well, I think part of the reason for that is we're legitimately friends with some of the folks that we get to have on, and so there's this kind of camaraderie.
Right.
And we've all had these conversations before, and I think that really helps. So, Justin, the man just poured his heart and soul out, and I appreciate every single bit of it. That was a fun it didn't even feel like an interview. It felt like a conversation with a friend.
It was just that, just a conversation.
He's always got something in the fire. You absolutely should go check out his work. For those of you who haven't read it, I cannot recommend Luther Strode enough. So Luther Strode is probably, I'd say that's my favorite book that he's done. What is, if you had to qualify it, what is his favorite work that you guys have read?
Reaver.
I was gonna say up to the point that Reaver came out, it would have been Luther Strode.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's Reaver for me now.
So just a ton of really, really cool stuff. Urban Animal is blowing up, like you said. But one of the things, and we didn't really talk to him about this, kind of time-wise, he's also done a lot of, I won't say a lot of Big Two work, but he's done some really, really good Big Two work. He did The Curse of Brimstone and Sideways, which I know, Craig, you were reading both of those.
Yeah. Brimstone was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And Sideways, I think he was just he was a co-writer on that one,
right?
But both were really good, but Brimstone was just absolutely amazing.
He hadn't done much that I haven't liked, if anything at all. Savage Things, man, with Ibrahim Mustafa, just Vertigo in some of its best forms. That book was. So yeah, if you haven't read his work, we dropped a lot of names. You 100% should. It's well worth your time, and you will hopefully thank us for it, because it's just really, really killer work. So I got nothing else to say about my man. He is solid, and that was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, comic shops are still mostly shut down across the nation. We all have the benefit of living in a state that hasn't completely ground to a halt, and we have a really cool local comic shop that is still. It's not completely open, but it is open for business in a way that if you can navigate it, you go in one at a time, two at a time, keep distance apart. They're doing curbside, and that's Kapow Comics in Sherwood. So as always, a big loving shout out to the Kapow Comics crew for taking really good care of us. Which means for us, we get to go pick up some books. And it's not new stuff. It's stuff that's been on the shelf for a while, stuff we wanted to read. Or we also have the benefit of being longtime collectors with a whole library worth of stuff wherever we keep it. For me, it's in my attic, which, by the way, it's climate controlled. So all of you nerd boys out there, calm down. Don't send me hate mail for keeping comics in my attic. I take care of it. But we get to read stuff that we haven't read in a while. So I'm kind of curious, what have you guys been reading, or what do you suggest folks to pick up in the next week or so?
Well, I picked something up at the comic shop last week that I'm going to start reading. I'm reading From the House of M, World of M, featuring Wolverine, and these are all the Wolverine stories collected in one edition during that House of M storyline.
That's kind of rad. I didn't know that existed. Who are some of the creators on that?
Well, there's a bunch of them, yeah, and I didn't know it existed either. Writers like Daniel Way, Reginald, it's like pronounced Hudlin, Ed Brubaker, Brian Michael Bendis. That's the writers that make up. Going back to artists, the artists are varied because you've got breakdowns, finishers, but let's see, there's Javier Saltieres. Mark Teixeira does the finishes in one of these books, which caught my eye.
Nice.
Yeah, right. Pencils, see, also got Trevor, let's see, what is that? Hairsing. Inks by John Dell. Let's see, another one, a breakdown by Michael Lark. Inks by Stefano Gardiano.
Mm-hmm.
Lee Weeks on another one.
Nice.
Jesse, let's see, what is that? Del Perdang. Mike Perkins, also another inker. And then, that makes up all the inkers and the writing team and all these.
That's rad. Can I play with that when you're done with it?
Absolutely. It's got a cover. The cover's done by Joe Quesada.
Nice.
Looks really cool. Joe Quesada is a guy whose art I miss.
I think he'd made a good name for himself, and he moved up into some. For him, it was a better position, but it sucks not seeing his stuff.
Yeah.
Anymore.
Yeah. I always liked his stuff. Very unique.
Samesies. Well, what about you, Craig? What you reading, or what do you suggest that folks pick up this week from the back issue bin?
Well, I just changed my mind because I don't know if you guys know this, but there are some new floppies coming out this week.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And one that I'm going to recommend people will get to their comic book store and pick up is Ludocrats #1 by Image Comics. It's Kieran Gillen, Jeff Stokely, Jim Resiginal, and Tamara Monvian. A collision of ornate fantasy of Dune and an M-rated asterisk and Obelix is what it says. So I'm pretty excited about this.
That sounds awesome. And that is coming out this week?
That is on the slate to come out this week.
I guess I'm just so used to comics not coming out. I don't think I realized that next week new books were going to start hitting the stands. That's encouraging.
It's not a whole lot. There's maybe 40 or so new comics hitting this week. Marvel doesn't have any coming out, but there are a handful of new ones.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm giddy.
Yep, I am too.
One of the books, because I asked the proprietor of the local comic book shop what he knew he was getting, because he said he wasn't totally sure on everything, but he looked, and the Red Sonja is coming out this week as well.
Yeah. Nice. Oh, that makes my heart happy. Well, I say that, and it does make my heart happy, but I don't know about you guys. I have had a blast, reaching out and reading some stuff that has been sitting around for a while, and grabbing stuff that I otherwise wouldn't have grabbed.
Absolute same, and I'm going to continue to do that.
Yeah. So am I, because I honestly sometimes think that we get because we buy books every week that comes with a certain amount of pressure to read them as fast. Well, no, seriously, to read them as fast as possible, and
I'm
not.
laughing because it's absolutely true.
Yeah, you sit and ruminate with it, like which is what we've been able to do, and that's been nice. So one of the books that I've been ruminating with started it this morning actually during my when we would regularly record was it's a collection of 4 books that I have. I have and I started this not too long ago. Been reading a whole lot of the Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale stuff. Everything from like our Superman for All Seasons, which I talked about with you guys not too long ago. But there is a collection from Marvel that it collects four series that they did, and it's Daredevil Yellow, Superman Blue, or Spider-Man Blue, excuse me, Hulk Gray, and Captain America White, which are all collections of 6-issue series that they did. That really, again, if you know Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, it's a love letter to the characters. It's a love letter to the creators that made those characters. And those two just like to me, those two are one person. They might as well be. They are such an iconic package deal. You kind of know exactly what you're going to get from them, and what you're going to get is really good. So if you can find this hardcover collection, I highly recommend it. Again, it's yellow, blue, gray, and white from Loeb and Sale. So
Very cool.
just stunning stuff. And speaking of stunning stuff, our podcast is stunning, in my opinion, and it's made so mostly by y'all because I just kind of ramble. But part of the cool thing about the podcast is we are online and interactive, and if you like the podcast and you want more of it, you want more to talk to more people, maybe who like comics like we do. You want to make new friends. Maybe you want to build a connection with somebody like Justin Jordan. I'm not neighbors with the guy. I just met him in person, but became online friends and built a relationship that's lasted years, and it's been rad. In doing that, we have our Facebook group, which you can be a part of. All you got to do is you go to Facebook, you click the little mousey, click in the search bar, and you type in Southern Fried Geekery, and we'll pop up, and you ask to be a member of the group, and you can be. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter. We're at SFG Podcast on both of those. We have an email address. Who uses email anymore, honestly? But we have one. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, fire off an email. If you want to know more about where you can get Justin's stuff, that's where you do it. You let us know. If you want to, ask Craig about his thoughts and theories on a really amazing movie that he just watched, you should do that through our email, and we'll forward that information. We'll happily get it there. I have had the most fun doing this. I miss you guys. I can't wait to get back to recording this podcast in person. Hopefully sooner rather than later, but until that time, I've got nothing else. So let's go forth and love some comics.
Woo!
That was a quality woo.
Thanks. It was a quality show. Gets a quality woo.
Yeah, that's right.
Damn right.
So,
Does that mean that your once lackluster woo was that a reflection of mine?
That's what it means, Caleb. So mental note for you and I. Mental note for you and I.
Oh boy, now I'm gonna be paranoid.